Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 167. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Patricia Grayhall about her debut memoir, Making the Rounds, a coming-of-age story set in the late 1960s and 1970s. Defying expectations, Patricia came out as a lesbian at the age of 19 and pursued her dream of becoming a medical doctor. In Making the Rounds, Patricia shares what it was like for her as she tried to have both love and a medical career at a time when society disapproved of both for a woman. While she hopes her book will entertain, she also hopes it can serve as a survival guide for others who are told their passions or ambitions are wrong. Patricia describes the experience of reliving her own story while writing this book as a roller coaster, but one that allowed her to develop compassion for herself. In this episode, I'll chat with Patricia about her writing journey, what it was like for her to reconnect with the people in her memoir after all these years, and what she really thinks of the idea that women can have it all, as well as a few other things, coming up. Patricia Grayhall, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you, Stacey. I'm pleased to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new book, a memoir, Making the Rounds, Defying Norms in Love and Medicine. If you don't mind, tell us a bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Sure. My story is basically about coming of age in the late 1960s and 1970s as a young woman striving to have both love and career as a lesbian and a medical doctor when neither one was approved by society. And it was very much like Vita Sackville West's No Signposts in the Sea. It pretty much sums up my experience studying and training to be a doctor in the early 70s. And this was before Title IX, which prohibited discrimination in education based on sex. As only one of 5 women in my class of 100 in Salt Lake City, Utah, and the only woman in my internship in Boston, I encountered few, if any, female role models that could affirm my ambition or provide any encouragement. So, tossed around in the rough seas of medical training, I was chronically exhausted and emotionally drained, and I yearned to have a stable love relationship that could offer the same care and support that my male colleagues seemed to find in their wives and girlfriends. Though I loved women, the only model of relationship I knew was heteronormative, and my exposure to the women's movement in Boston at that time, that is the early 70s, it taught me that female eroticism was cause for celebration, but it provided few role models for how to sustain relationship with a woman beyond desire. So being open with such love threatened my ambition to become a doctor. So Making the Rounds is the story of how I navigated those seas without signposts, tossed by the tempest, battered but never broken. It's like Brené Brown says, one day you'll tell your story of how you overcame what you went through, and it will be someone else's survival guide. So I hoped that my book would be not only entertaining, perhaps to those who lived through those times, but also someone else's survival guide.
Let me ask you. It's a memoir, it's your story. What made you decide to write it now?
Well, originally I wrote it just for myself. I found journals and letters that had been hidden away in a box in my closet for 40 years when my partner and I were downsizing. And I sat down and started going through and reading those. And it, reading these after 40 years evoked intense feelings. It was almost as though I was back there again. And I had many questions that I wanted to answer for myself. And after I wrote several drafts, I realized that though my personal story was unique, it was shaped by the culture and the politics of the times. And I thought that it would likely appeal not only to people near my age, but younger people who've ever lived the burden of being told their passions or ambitions are wrong. So I thought if I took it upon myself to learn how to write creatively, my book would inspire not only LGBTQ people, but also other marginalized people, female, disabled, people of color who are struggling to fulfill dreams that other people take for granted. And I also wanted younger people to know what it was like on a visceral level through my story, what it was like before Title IX and before Roe v. Wade and before greater acceptance of same-sex love relationships. Because the gains we've made are very fragile, as clearly indicated by the recent Supreme Court decision to take away a woman's right to control her own body.
And what was it like for you reliving that story to put it down on paper? Because it's one thing just to read something from your past, think about things, live with those memories for a bit, but writing your story means you were reliving it day after day, multiple times through multiple drafts. What was that like for you?
It was very intense. It was a roller coaster ride for many reasons. But I started from a good place. I mean, I had a long, successful career. I was now retired, and I have a happy long-term relationship that's gone on for 20 years. And it seemed like a good time. And I know, sometimes looking into the past, you might find answers to questions that were unresolved or too painful to contemplate at the time. And I realize, of course, the past isn't dead. It lives on inside of us and influences us, whether we're aware of it or not. And it shapes our present responses and reactions and who we are now. So, yeah, I wanted to go through this process and answer questions for myself. How did I manage to survive potentially damaging relationships with men, the rigors of medical training in an environment that was often hostile to women and queer people, and betrayal in love?
You went looking for those answers. Did you find them? Did you realize like you had the answers, you've lived those answers as you've created the life you've created? Or did the answers come to you as you were writing them? Is that when the realization hit you?
Well, the beauty of writing memoir is that in the process of creating structure and arc, you can often see things that get lost in just the day-to-day chaos of your life. So when I finally, after writing many drafts, could see what the arc of my story was and how transformative that whole period was for me, I was able to really take control of the narrative and find, answers to those questions, and also develop some compassion for myself. There were a few chapters that were cringeworthy to write, that I hadn't really ever talked to anybody about before. And after I had written them and shared them with a few close friends, I developed new perspective.
Were there sections that were particularly difficult to write? And if so, in what ways were they difficult?
A couple of sections were difficult, and one was involved a relationship with an older man that I kind of, in my thrashing around trying to become a straight woman, I got involved in. And then another one that was difficult to write was I had a quarter of the book is devoted to a tumultuous relationship I had with a woman during my medical residency. And it was really difficult to go back and feel all those old feelings again, particularly because as the pandemic broke in March of 2020, it was also my 70th birthday on that day when it was declared a worldwide pandemic. And I had decided that I was going to travel from Seattle to Florida to visit a dear old friend, David, who features prominently in my book, but also to see that woman that I had not had any contact with for 40 years. We ended up having a 5-hour meeting. We met in the middle of the state, and it was very emotional, but it was also very enlightening and provided some perspective and some closure, some answers to some questions for me. So though it was difficult and emotional, it was, in the end, it was very enlightening and ultimately satisfying.
And were there any parts that were fun to write or brought you great joy when you were putting them down on the page?
Well, it was really fun to write about my friend David. He's been my friend, for over 50 years. We went to medical school together, did our residency together, and we lived through many trying times as well as happy times. And it was fun to write about that and some of our antics and to share those with him. And also the chapter that I wrote about coming out when I came out as a lesbian in San Francisco in 1969, that chapter was kind of fun to write because I just thought, I was amazed at my younger self, what chutzpah I had and how daring I was at that time.
Did you have to do any research for the book? I mean, this was a life you led, so these were your memories, your recollections, your conversations. Were there any things you had to research? And did you find that your memory held up when you went back and researched, or were there things that you found you couldn't wholly trust in your memory?
Well, as you know, memory is never perfect. There's a lot of flaws in memory, and I did have to go back. Well, fortunately, I had journals and letters for most of the time period I wrote about, and I referred to them a great deal. But there were gaps, and I found sometimes, for example, I found that I was pregnant at age 19, and just after at the end of my first year of college, and I have only a vague recollection of that, how I knew I was pregnant, and I just assumed that I must have done a pregnancy test. But actually, home pregnancy tests were not available in 1969. So I'm glad that I actually looked that up and realized it was probably a matter of just missed periods before I consulted a doctor. But other things, I actually, many of the characters in my book, in fact, most of them are still my friends. And so when I wrote my first drafts, I was able to go back and show them what I'd written. And, have them fill in any things that they remembered. And of course, they didn't always remember things the way I did, but in the end, all of them acknowledged the truth of my own experience of it. So that was helpful too. In fact, there's a couple of scenes that I totally forgot that my first long-term girlfriend remembered in vivid detail. And after she reminded me of it, it all came back to me, and I was glad it did, because it was an interesting scene.
You mentioned a bit earlier about what you were hoping readers would get from the book, but I'm curious, did you have specific goals in mind for the book before you started writing it, or did your goals for the book, your hopes for the reader, evolve as you were writing it or when you had finished your draft?
Well, I think in the beginning, I did have a clear notion that I hoped my book would inspire others to lead authentic lives and pursue their dreams. And as I went along, it occurred to me that it was also in part a cautionary tale for women who've been led to believe they can have it all, when in fact choices have to be made along the way as we strive to discover what truly matters to each of us as individuals. And another thing that I discovered is I was in my 20s thrashing around quite a bit, trying to figure out how to be in relationship. And I think as I completed my narrative, I realized it's also an illustration of how important trust is in relationships. And if the bounds of trust are breached, how difficult it is to get back to intimacy.
And what has been the feedback you've received on this book? What has the reaction of readers been to the story?
Well, believe it or not, at first I only shared my writing with a writing coach at Seattle University, because I just thought, well, I can't show any of this to anybody. It's just too personal. So I didn't show it to any of my friends. And then when she urged me to consider writing it for publication, I thought, well, I can't do that, and unless I write it under a pen name, in part because I'm not only to protect my own privacy. I didn't think I wanted my former colleagues and patients to read this. I also didn't want to jeopardize the privacy of some of my major characters. One, for example, has been married to a man for 27 years, and our love relationship, she's kept a secret all this time. Another woman has always claimed to be totally straight, and yet we ended up having an affair, and I'm not sure she would like that acknowledged in the world. So, and then of course I had to protect all the names of my patients, because I described some medical scenes in the book that are very detailed about some of them. So it just seemed overall important to write under a pen name. And finally, when I decided to have other people read it, I formed a writing group, and I had 5 other individuals in my writing group read sections of it. And then I took a writing course from Brooke Warner and Linda Joy Myers on writing memoir, and that was a 6-month course. So in the end, Brooke Warner, who was my mentor, ended up reading it all. At first, I thought her reaction was fairly critical, but every time she told me to correct something, I'd go back and change it. I just worked and worked and worked at it, which is what I do. And in the end, she told me she hoped that I would publish it with her press. So that's how it ended up getting into the publishing stream. And then, of course, you have to send out your advanced reader copies to people to read before the book is released to get some advanced reviews. And I was really pleased. I mean, I sent it out to people and I just kept getting 5-star after 5-star review, and even got a starred review from Kirkus, and similarly 5-star reviews from Book Life and the Seattle Book Review and others. So on the whole, I would say I've gotten enormous positive feedback. I realize, especially after I had one of my close friends read it, and she had a problem with the personal detail in it because it was me. And that was my first negative response to my book, at least for parts of my book. I decided I'm going to have to grow thick skin, because once it's out in the world, there'll be some people who won't like it. And I'll just have to deal with that. I've been spoiled, by all this positivity in the beginning.
This book is a memoir. Is it something you've always thought you would do? Did you ever have an inkling when you were younger that you would write a memoir?
Not really. When I was a child, I used to write poetry, and I wrote a few stories that my mother thought were really good. But, I was heavily science oriented, and even early on, I knew I was going to become either a scientist or a doctor. And so on that track, it pretty much ruled out a lot of English classes or creative writing classes. And then, of course, once I was in my career in medicine, I mainly read medical books and articles. But I also wrote. Have dozens of medical articles and books, chapters that I've written, and presentations. So I had experience writing, but no experience at all with creative writing really as an adult. And then when I decided that I had a lot of rich material for which to write a memoir, then I realized I really had to learn the craft of creative writing, how to do scenes and dialogue and structure an arc of a story. And I delve into that with gusto. I mean, I took lots of classes at Hugo House and online classes in the 6-month memoir writing course. And my ability to write creatively, developed and flowered over the 3 years that it took to write this book.
Now that you've written it and you've published it and it's out in the world, do you have plans for more books?
Well, so initially my partner was not very pleased that I had my head stuck in the sand of the past, especially since it involved numerous old girlfriends. So I decided that maybe if we wrote a novel together, that she would understand the allure of writing. And so during National Book Writing Month, anyway, it's in November, NaNoWriMo, we embarked on writing a romance novel together. And fortunately, she caught the bug and went off to write her own romance novel later, but we still have that. And now that I have pretty much finished all the editing and everything I need to do on this book, I'm going to take that out again and revise it and put it out there. I think writing a novel is so much easier than writing memoir, at least for me.
In writing this book and beginning this writing journey, has anything really surprised you about either the process of writing or the business of writing? Has there been anything that has really shocked you, something you didn't know when you first started?
I'm not sure it was so much the writing process as just how rich it was to reconnect with the characters in my memoir. many of them I had stayed in touch with, but they're far flung all over the United States. And we would be in touch occasionally, but in the process of writing this book, I got in touch with them more often and even made an effort to travel to see them in person. And in that process of talking about, our lives, we've borne witness to each other's lives, and the trust and the understanding that we have of each other with all our flaws and, past mistakes, it's really deepened our friendship. And I think that's been the biggest surprise and benefit for me of writing this book, is just the deepening and renewal of those friendships that I so much value.
And have you received any advice along the way? Obviously, you've taken a lot of classes and you have mentors. Has there been any piece of advice that you find yourself going back to on a regular basis, something that you would pass along to other similarly situated writers?
Probably the best piece of advice I got was that writing is a skill. It's a skill that can be learned. People are not born writers, and although writing is hard, if you work hard at it, at learning the skill, which I do, I work hard at whatever I put my mind to, it's something that can be learned and developed over time. So I think that was the most important thing for me, for the best piece of advice that I got.
Well, if people want to learn more about you and the book and things going on, look for perhaps that new release down the road, where should they go to find you and that information?
Well, my book was released October 11th of this year, 2022. And it is available wherever books are sold. My publisher has traditional distribution, so it'll be in bookstores, most online retailers, libraries, everywhere. And I also have an audiobook, which is beautifully narrated by a voice actor, Alex Picard, which will be available along with the print and ebook. And as for learning more about me, I have a website, patriciagrayhall.com. I'm also on Facebook under Patricia Grayhall Author, and Instagram, also Patricia Grayhall Author. I also am, I have been involved in events and interviews, which will be on Apple Podcasts and such.
Wonderful. So, Patricia, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with making the rounds, defying norms in love and medicine. Congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you, Stacy. It was a pleasure.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.